The barkeep asked why we carried weapons inside. We said mimics. They laughed. We laughed. The table laughed. Then we killed the table. Good times, told by an unknown treasure hunter and adventurer. Let it be known, gentles, that this is a Christmas special, and I would be enjoying it in proper comfort, had a certain festive mimic not devoured my divine turkey last winter. The bird was exquisite, and oh, by the gods, the platter, all of it eaten. I remember watching half the trimmings go up in a single gulp, leaving me with nothing but a rescued bottle of Golden Field white wine and a new professional grudge. Since that tragic morning, my seasonal doctrine is simple, dearest reader. If it sits still and looks helpful, assume it is more than what it appears to be. In my experience, assume it is either an overly helpful butler, or perhaps, if you are of the unlucky variety, a mimic. Look, when I tell you not to touch anything, I have a very good reason. I once informed a bright-eyed adventurer in Waterdeep, the sort who thinks traps were manipulations or cunning rumors put about by nervous people. Sometimes the dungeon bites back, said another weary soul. In this case, the dungeon was one of the busiest market squares in the city, and the biter was a very dignified-looking statue that had somehow appeared among the other works. A statue the local sculptor swore he had never carved, which everyone sensibly ignored until it was far too late. For 2 winters, it stood there, as harmless as any other bit of civic stonework, while street derelicts and stray animals quietly vanished on dark, moonless nights nearby, their absence noted only by those with long memories and short patience for coincidence. At last, someone in the watch decided that folk disappearing next to that odd statue warranted more than a shrug, and a sewer opening beside it was prized up and probed, revealing a shaft filled to a depth of over 60 feet with bones, human remains and animals mixed together in a way that suggested the eater had no particular preference beyond available, typical to their palate. While officers argued over what sort of monster must be lurking below, 2 bold souls stepped up to the statue and prodded it with their spears, more to be thorough than from any real suspicion. The stone shivered, lost its edges, and blossomed into a glistening mass studded with eyes and a single, vast maw, which promptly ate both guards before anyone could do more than shout their names in horror. The square erupted into chaos. Fireballs and ice knives were cast from nearby mages who oversaw the ruckus. Any spell you can think of that wouldn't cause too much damage along River Street. And I, being a man of the quill rather than my own stomach, withdrew to a safer doorway and took very careful notes. So, when I warn you at Christmas time not to trust that innocent chest by the hearth, or that generous sideboard bearing an unattended turkey, I do so as both scholar and victim. For I have seen mimics feast in market squares and at my own table. And if you remember nothing else from Volo's Guide to the Mimic, remember this. In cities, in dungeons, and especially around holiday banquets, never place blind faith in the furniture. Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. In their natural forms, mimics are little more than roaming stomachs, their blobby bodies covered with alien eyes and teeth. They can alter their color, texture, and dimensions to duplicate inanimate objects of their approximate size. Mimics use their disguises as both camouflage and bait. Once victims draw close, mimics strike, lashing out with their sticky pseudopods and toothy mouths. After consuming victims, mimics usually relocate, change form, and await their next meal. The legend seems little more than a joke when told across a tavern table. A chest of treasure in the deepest recesses of a dungeon suddenly transforms into a monstrosity, attacking those who had been set to loot it a moment earlier. Adventurers who have recounted these tales of the mimic do not laugh at its deadly threat. For countless ages, these creatures of the far realm have assumed apparently harmless forms, infiltrated settled lands, and hunted sentient humanoids, Impersonator mimics absorb the language and memories of the creatures they devour, sometimes carrying on the victim's life as normal while scouting for new prey. As an impersonator kills, it eventually splits into new object mimics and mimic spawn, which mature to become impersonator mimics and continue the cycle. Although mimics come from the far realm, they have found the world's dungeons to be good hunting grounds. These amorphous, slime-like creatures take the forms of everyday objects in their chosen environments. Treasure chests, religious altars, and elaborate doorways are among their favorite shapes because they attract the attention of curious passers-by. A mimic waits, indistinguishable from the surrounding features until prey comes within reach. Then the creature shows its true nature, becoming a writhing mass of ooze, teeth, and tendrils. Experienced adventurers know to be alert for a mimic whenever they discover an interesting object while dungeon delving, and such caution has denied the creatures many potential meals over the years. As a result, some mimics have wised up, taking the forms of humanoids and actively hunting gullible prey. As these mimics become more common in dungeons, and sometimes on the surface world, adventurers recently have started second-guessing everyone they meet, wondering if a new acquaintance is really a toothy mass of hungry slime. Mimics ally with few creatures other than their own kind and more powerful aberrant monsters. However, mimics in the world and the Underdark can form a kind of symbiotic relationship with other creatures. Mimics sometimes inhabit the lairs of constructs or incorporeal undead, lurking within the shadows to devour the remains of victims that those monsters cannot consume. Dragons and other powerful creatures sometimes keep object mimics to guard their treasure in return for a steady diet of intruders and explorers, bane to adventurers everywhere. Mimics are curious predators that shapeshift into the form of objects commonly found in dungeons, crates, doors, and, most often, treasure chests. Once their prey draws close, the mimic ensnares it in their sticky body. The shapeshifters rely on this strategy as it provides an ample supply of food. Weary, foolish adventurers are in no short supply and also make for a fine meal. Dungeoneering wisdom holds that mimics are a sort of karmic justice for unwary adventurers, if not literally, then at least by metaphor. Nearly anything can kill you in a dungeon, from sudden pit traps to magical curses to the dungeon's denizens. Mimics, therefore, create a neat illustration for all dungeoneering pitfalls. I would say, dearest reader, if you didn't inspect everything carefully and move with caution, that door, wall, or treasure chest might be a mimic lying in wait. Mimic biology only allows them to replicate an object while perfectly still. Once moving, their eyes, teeth, and purple tongues are on full display. However, mimics which assume a form for too long stiffen in that shape, gaining some traits of their object of choice. A mimic long in the shape of a barrel, for instance, would be able to roll on its side without deforming, and might even hold some contents while waiting for the best chance to ambush its prey. Chapter 2. Hidden in Plain Sight. This chapter, Gentles, is where I set aside the comforting folly of campfire tales and give you the plain, sharp truth. Because while you may giggle at the notion of a chest with teeth, you will not giggle as it drags you across the floor by your sleeve. And I should hate to have my scholarship blamed for your poor grip strength. Mimics are magically created creatures, bred by wizards who had argued and thought it was prudent to protect their precious hoards from treasure hunters, and instead succeeded in creating a predator that punishes everyone equally, including, on occasion, the very wizard who commissioned it, which I find heartening in a small, vindictive corner of my soul. A mimic's body is a marvel of rude practicality. It bears a hard, rock-like outer shell that guards softer inner organs, and it possesses a talent for altering both form and pigmentation so deftly that it can present itself as something you want to touch. Unfortunately, your inability to keep your hands in your pockets placates the mimic. who then immediately teaches you why touching unfamiliar things is a habit best left to children and fools. Most mimics are content to appear as treasure chests because greed is reliable and adventurers are reliably greedy, yet do not let that familiarity lull you. For a mimic is not married to any single shape and will happily become a door, a statue base, a stair, a section of stonework, or any other object that invites hands, feet, or curiosity. In its natural state, the creature's color is a speckled gray, a tone that resembles granite well enough to pass in poor light, and with a brief effort, it can shift its surface to resemble marble, wood grain, and various metals, gold, silver, copper, requiring roughly 10 seconds to complete the alteration, which is just enough time for you to notice if you had trained yourself to spy oddities within your vision, and just little enough time for you to regret your laziness to study if you had not. One comfort, if it can be called such, is that a mimic cannot lose mass when it transforms. It must remain the same overall size, though it may redistribute that bulk into a shape that suits its appetite. And it is remarkable how quickly a harmless chest becomes a very convincing doorway when it decides you would taste better if you were nearer. Now, let us speak of varieties, for not all mimics are equally clever, and it is a grim comfort to know whether you are dealing with a calculating villain or a hungry slab of doom. The common mimic is smaller and more intelligent, typically occupying about 150 cubic feet, the volume of a large chest or a broad doorframe, and it can be surprisingly shrewd, possessing its own tongue, a corruption of the language spoken by its wizard creators. And, with patience and the sort of lessons I would not volunteer to teach, it can also learn the common tongue and other languages, which is deeply unsettling the first time a chest asks you, quite politely, whether you intend to pay for the privilege of leaving the dungeon with that gold coin you just stole from its intestine. The killer mimic is larger, around 200 cubic feet, less intelligent and incapable of speech. No wrangling for a better deal, and you guessed it. Threatening it with your bravado will equally be a waste of effort, and it does not deliver dramatic monologues, which is frankly its only redeeming trait, because it will simply attack regardless of your attempts at diplomacy, prayer, or pleading. The most familiar hazard is the object mimic, the kind that becomes a plain, unadorned chest in a dusty chamber, a barred oak door, surely leading to secrets, or a priceless artwork positioned at the exact height where a hand reaches out before the brain has a chance to object. It is a predator that hunts not by pursuit, but by patience, and it relies on two weaknesses found in every dungeon delver: curiosity and greed. It holds still, perfectly, maddeningly still, until a creature comes into contact with it, and then the lesson begins. More dreadful, and I do not use that word lightly, is the impersonator mimic, which does not limit itself to furniture and architecture, but takes on the forms of people, and does so with a wicked understanding of how kindness opens doors more readily than threats. I have heard accounts, credible ones, which is to say they contain fewer heroic embellishments than usual, of a young girl begging for bread, of an old woman offering help, and of that help being repaid with silence of the victim and an unmarked grave. Then the mimic, wearing the old woman's form, lures another victim inside with some perfectly ordinary request, and later walks abroad as that victim to place itself among new prey, which is not clever in a scholarly sense, but is disgustingly effective in the real world where folk do not expect a familiar face to be a mouth in disguise. Try this, dearest reader. Think of a time, most probably there will be many, of how many small intricacies within life you have missed, simply by being stuck within your own imagination. The mimic uses that preoccupation as its secret ingredient. And where there is such a mimic, there may also be spawn, smaller horrors that scuttle through windows, doors, and chimneys under their master's direction, shifting shape as commanded, and serving as a reminder that some problems do not merely exist, they reproduce. In combat, mimics favor the simplest tactic imaginable. Wait until you touch them, and then use that curiosity to spring their trap. They produce a powerful adhesive secretion that traps victims in place, and while you are stuck, often with a hand, arm, or entire torso unwillingly committed, they lash with pseudopods, battering and restraining until the main maw can do its work. That same adhesive is also their chief means of locomotion, allowing them to creep and cling with infuriating confidence. If you remember one practical countermeasure, remember this. Alcohol weakens the adhesive after a few seconds of application, and the glue becomes fully neutralized within less than a minute after the mimic's death, which means your brandy may save your life. And, if it does, you have my full permission to call it medicinal afterward, with a straight face. Mimics prefer to live underground, where they can avoid sunlight, and place themselves among stonework, doors, and other convenient disguises. And they are solitary creatures by preference, not virtue, for a mimic wants a large grazing area and has no interest in sharing prey with anything that might argue over portions. They have no culture, no moral code, and no interest in religion, art, or the softer pursuits, unless you count the pursuit of your ankles, because their concerns are survival and food, full stop. The common mimic, being intelligent, will sometimes trade information in exchange for food, and if you find yourself haggling with a chest over rations, I suggest you do it briskly and with your sword arm free, while the killer mimic will simply attempt to eat you regardless of what charming words you offer, which is at least consistent. Wizards who keep mimics as guardians often discover an unpleasant truth. The creature's obedience is frequently enthusiastic only up to the point where it becomes hungry, bored, or offended, and it is astonishing how easily a wizard offends a thing that thinks with its stomach. Mimics were created to thwart treasure hunters. This is accurate in the sense that 1 or 2 humans can sustain them for weeks, which is why a mimic does not need to feed often to be deadly, as it only feeds once in a while to remain a continuing nuisance. They reproduce by splitting their shape through cellular division, growing to full size over several years. I would say that the commonality of all mimics to assume familiar shapes was not always this scribe's experience. Let me tell you of a quick tale within Waterdeep and of ice cream. Yes, the last kiss of a meal was on my very thoughts, but luckily for me, and unlucky for one very hungry mimic, the flavor that the shopkeeper handed me was not of my favorite variety, so I promptly returned it, with a fuss I might add, until I later thanked him as I saw 2 protruding red eyes come from the top of the cream. Their skin is covered with optical sensors sensitive to heat and light within roughly 90 feet, even in pitch darkness, which makes them keenly aware of movement around them. Yet it also gives you another tool besides prayer. A powerful light source can blind them, and direct sunlight is especially ruinous, hence their preference for underground haunts where the sun cannot expose them for the frauds they are. Beyond glue, they can excrete a liquid that smells of rotting meat, used to attract smaller prey such as rats. And if you are wondering why the dungeon corridor reeks, now you know, and I promise you that knowing will not make you feel better. Finally, because there is always someone who insists on taking souvenirs, Mimic Ichor is useful in the creation of polymorph self-potions. Their glue and solvents fetch fair coin among alchemists, and certain internal organs are used in the manufacture of perfumes, which is a fact that tells you more about perfumers than it does about mimics. In some cultures, their organs are considered delicacies. I will record that without endorsement, and I will add only that, if your host serves mimic, you should ask what it was pretending to be before it was cooked. And with that, dear reader, you are armed with knowledge. An imperfect weapon, yes, but far preferable to optimism. So let us proceed, for the next chapter concerns practical precautions, profitable harvesting, and the rare but memorable circumstance of a mimic that decides you are not worth the trouble, which is both insulting and, occasionally, The best news you will hear all day. One last piece of advice for you, as the old aphorism goes. Never judge a book by its cover.